We're really, really thrilled to be introducing Fiona Spargo-Mabbs. Fiona is the founder of the drug education charity, the Daniel Spargo-Mabbs Foundation, which is dedicated to raising awareness about the negative impacts of substance use through quality harm reduction. Fiona's talk is going to be discussing the most recent scientific research into adolescent brain development, decision making, and also risk management. So it's going to be focusing more on the interactions of psychoactive substances and the brain, as well as the neurology of substance use disorders. So yeah, she's going to be offering practical strategies that we can all implement for safer decision making. I will say, as a content warning, this next talk is about drugs and may contain some themes that might trigger some people. So yeah, just a content warning there. But yeah, without further ado, welcome Fiona.
Hi, thanks Brie, and thanks everyone for inviting me along to speak. Today is Harm Reduction Day, so my focus in terms of harm reduction really is around decision making, because it's really, really important to know stuff, but it's also really important to be able to put that knowledge into practice when it comes to making decisions. And adolescence, which is the period of life at which most people are attending university, is a time when making decisions can be very difficult, and managing risk can be very difficult. Our primary audience is teenagers, and some kind of early 20s, but mostly teenagers. We offer drugs education mostly in schools, so probably the average age of person that I talk to is 15, or the parent of a 15-year-old, or the teacher of a 15-year-old. But that process and that critical period of development goes on for 15 years, which is one of the things that I want to talk about. But managing risk and decision making during that time is tricky for reasons that we'll look at. Oh, I haven't opened my slides, let me do that. But is an absolutely core component of harm reduction. So I'm really glad to be able to talk to you today about that. Let me get back, and I'm going to share my slides with you. Okay, so this is us, Daniel Spargo-Mabbs Foundation. Our tagline is supporting young people to make safe choices about drugs, because that decision-making thing is absolutely at the heart of everything when it comes to being safe with drugs and around drugs and alcohol. And the reason for the charity being started in the first place is my son Dan of the Daniel Spargo-Mabbs Foundation. I was going to start by telling you a little bit of a story, so you know what I'm going to be covering. But I was going to tell you the story of a decision that went badly wrong. That's my son Dan. Dan, when he was 16, took some MDMA, and unfortunately what he got was incredibly strong. It was 12 times stronger than had caused fatality in the past. He massively overheated, and he died from multiple organ failure a couple of days later. So that's kind of Dan's story in a nutshell. But behind that, obviously, was a whole load of decision making that was going on for Dan. Let me stop there. I want to tell you a little bit about Dan, because Dan wasn't somebody. Dan was just Dan. You know, he wasn't anybody that would have been on anybody's radar, that people have a radar for who might come to harm from drugs. Dan was prom king at the end of his year 11. So everybody loved Dan. He was that boy, you know, all the girls had a crush on him. He'd got a lovely girlfriend, Jenna. He'd been going out for more than 2 years. He was doing really, really well at school. He was bright, he was funny, he was chatty, he was into drama, you know, all that stuff. He was prom king. He was voted runner up in funniest boy, nicest eyes, boy most likely to be prime minister. He wasn't voted boy most likely to die from drugs, and he wouldn't have been. That would be a mean category to have anyway, obviously. But so what happened to Dan? It kind of, just in terms of using Dan as a case study of decision making and what can make that really difficult. So Dan, at the end of GCSEs, I recognise he's younger than the people that I'm talking to, but nevertheless not very much younger, and he was in that period of adolescence that many of you will also be in, and the people that you're working with and supporting and wanting to support will be in. So Dan was 16. At the end of GCSEs, he went to Reading Festival, as so many people do, or Leeds Festival, or wherever it is that you're from. But those two festivals are key ones. You get your GCSE results, you go off to Reading Festival. Now that for Dan, weed had been around for a while, as for most people, most young people. And but that was the first time that he had seen anyone taking MDMA or ecstasy. Maybe he'd led a sheltered life, I don't know. But that was the first time he came home. Dan was endlessly chatting. He'd go, Mom, you should have seen them. They'd taken, and they were doing this, and they looked like this, and they were saying that, and it was so funny. And so I had the Leah Betts conversation, one pill can kill, and you don't know what you're getting, and all of that stuff. And then from that, 5 months later, Dan was dead. So from the first time, from MDMA, that journey for him involved, I mean, as it will do, it's in a social context. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about, is that drug use is, generally speaking, happens within a social environment. We all inhabit social environments anyway. So even if we're using drugs in a solitary way, there's a social environment around that. But for so many young people, that there is a social dynamic at work in that decision making. So for Dan, there was a particular friend who'd got very involved in cocaine and MDMA use over that summer after GCSEs, and we found out this story of Dan's decision making 6 months after he died. So we got his phone back from the police. The police had arrested a couple of lads for supply, and there was a trial, there was a sentencing, and then we got Dan's phone back, and we were able to see kind of this backstory and try and make sense of this thing that didn't really make sense, still doesn't really make sense, to be honest. But so it turned out that a friendship group, Dan was friends with literally everybody. So I don't know if you know Mean Girls, but Mean Girls, Dan could have sat on anyone's table. But that included a group for whom drug taking had become quite a normal kind of thing. And a particular friend who'd been a really good friend since year 7, who, as I say, had got very involved in MLK. So lots of messages, kind of, she'd be with this lad at the weekend. Her boyfriend, who she was using stuff with primarily, they were at school in the week, she'd go and stay with him at the weekend, and lots of messages. Dan, it's so amazing, Dan, you've got to try it, it's such amazing, it feels like this. And to start off with, Dan saying stuff like, look, just be careful, don't get addicted, I don't want you to end up on Jeremy Kyle. But then a couple of months before he died, they'd been to a gig together, she'd given him a little bit to try. They went to another gig a month or so later, and this time she got him and another friend some of their own from her supplier. And now that for Dan and for her hadn't been a great experience. He'd spent the next few days in bed with the temperature. I'd got no idea that's what it was, but I could see from the messages she'd also had bad reaction, and her reaction, as well as his own, had clearly really shaken him. And over those next maybe 6 weeks, it was until there's this night of the rave, I could see him making excuses when there was a party, there was a talk of festival the next summer, and I knew that they were excuses because they were to do with stuff that we were doing as a family that I know we weren't, or we wouldn't have been. And I think that was his way of kind of getting out. I think he perhaps knew that he would feel pressured or tempted or would end up doing something that he was now really unsure about. And then there's this rave on a Friday night in January. I just thought he was going to a party quite locally, but anyway, it was this illegal rave. It was the other side of London. It was mostly friends of a friend, so mostly people that didn't know Dan, which of course is a big risk factor in itself, and a very good friend, his friend Jack. 8 boys, 5 of them taking MDMA. One of them was Dan. One of the 3 that wasn't was Jack. And Jack said that he could see Dan, just this decision making on that night. They all dissolved it in water, this MDMA, and the other 4 boys were sipping theirs all the way across London, which took 3 or 4 hours. We live in South London. This was way out in kind of northwest London. And, you know, these illegal events, there's whole loads of faffing around on the way there because the final venue isn't released till really late. And Jack said all the way there, these other boys were sipping their MDMA and Dan was holding his back and he was watching them and he was just being a bit kind of wary and hesitant. And Jack said he was kind of watching him out the corner of his eye, you know, when because it was January and it was night and it's dark outside, but the lights were on the train and, you know, you can see the reflection. And Jack said he was kind of watching him out the corner of his eye and he said he could see that Dan was just being a bit wary and hesitant and looked a bit uncomfortable. And I'm sure nobody else would have noticed because they didn't really know Dan that well. But Jack said then that he wanted to say, look, Dan, if you don't want to take it, you don't have to take it. But he thought as soon as I say that, it's going to draw attention to the fact everyone else has and Dan hasn't, and maybe make it harder to sneak it away. And on that very, very last train, apparently somebody else just noticed that he hadn't had it and said, are you not having that then? And at that point, that moment of decision, Dan could have gone, no, I don't fancy it now. He could have just as easily have said that. And what was going on for him, we won't ever know. Whether he thought, I've paid 20 quid for it, might as well have it. Whether he thought, they're all fine, I'll be fine. He'd been watching them all. That was his primary harm reduction measure, Dan, because he didn't know stuff. I didn't know stuff. If only he'd sipped it, he would have picked up how incredibly strong it was. And that's where harm reduction and decision making is just vital, literally vital. But he didn't know that stuff. And he had it. And of course, it was incredibly strong. He had it all in one go, which was just the worst thing to have possibly done. But going back to that night again and that decision making, actually, it turned out he didn't really want to go to this rave. He hadn't been to that sort of event. He'd been to gigs and stuff, been to this festival, went to parties. But this was a whole different thing. And he knew that drugs would be part of that mix, and he was being really wary. And he's coming out with a whole load of excuses we could see that night to this particular friend, the one who'd given him drugs on those two previous occasions. Lots of excuses, random ones. I'm really tired. I haven't got any money. I'm falling asleep on the bus. I've got to get up early tomorrow, all those sorts of things. I've got to visit my granddad in hospital, which wasn't true. I mean, some of them very random like that. And if you're not going, I'm not going to go, because his friend wasn't even going. Anyway, it's complicated, is the point. It's really complicated, and things can go wrong badly if you don't know enough stuff. If Dan had known more, he would have been okay. Probably, almost certainly, he would have got to come home. But also in terms of those decision-making situations, for someone who was basically a strong, confident character, in adolescence, it's really hard. And that's what I wanted to talk about. Let me just move on to that. Sorry, that's my story over and done with. Choice, risk, and the adolescent brain. What is it about adolescence, that period between 10 and 25, which makes decision making and risk management difficult, and what can be done about that? So it's a really, really critical period of change, which we'll come on to look at. But in that critical period of change, there's a lot happening in terms of drugs being around for young people. So I've got a little bit of data for you. One of the sources of data, it's quite old now. They didn't renew it. They should have renewed this last term, but because of COVID they haven't. But every 2 years the government carries out a survey of schools and asks 11 to 15-year-olds lots and lots of questions about smoking, drinking and drugs. And in that survey, amongst the many things they asked was, had you been offered drugs? Had you tried drugs? And so, I mean, there's lots and lots and lots more detail than that. So this is quite kind of broad stuff, but this is controlled substances. So it's not alcohol, cigarettes. They ask e-cigarettes, I ask about that separately. But so for 11-year-olds, 16% in 2018 said that they'd been offered drugs, 9% had tried something. The last month question is obviously about kind of trying to pick up whether that is just a one-off or not, but of course it doesn't necessarily mean that. With 15-year-olds, 59% had been offered drugs, 38% had tried something. May just be once, may not. But at the beginning of this period of adolescence, for 11-year-olds, decisions are already being made about drugs. So drugs are around and about, and that level of exposure has increased as well over the time. We started this charity in 2014. Dan died in January 2014. In that time, that level of exposure has gone up. So the number of times young people are having to make decisions about drugs has really increased, which is why we started a drugs education charity. I didn't even tell you the story of the charity. We run a drugs education charity entirely because we realise how absolutely vital, as I've said before, literally vital, how life-saving, really good evidence-based drugs education can be. For older young people and adults, there's a different set of data which looked at 16 to 59-year-olds, and that found that 1 in 11 had used drugs, but the focus of that level of use is much more on the younger end of it. So full-time students, perhaps not surprisingly, compared to other occupational groups, more of them had used drugs in the last year than, you know, other occupational groups, builders or accountants or whatever. Prevalence of drug use is highest amongst that cohort. So not just students, but other people, young people that age as well. It's about 1 in 5. And drug use, again, unsurprisingly, higher amongst those reporting lower levels of well-being. So again, drug use and decisions about drugs are something that are around for young people. And the other thing that we've done, I'm doing quite a big piece of work around actually, is young people's exposure to drugs on social media, and how that has just grown and grown and grown. It's a bit kind of, that's another whole conversation, but it's a bit kind of Wild West in terms of the ability of the platforms to regulate or the police to do any kind of activity around stuff that's going on there. And one of the things that we've done is we run a survey this time last year and again this year in March, and that found that 1 in 3 15-year-olds had seen drugs being sold on social media, and more than half of 18-year-olds. And I think those of you that are students will be more than aware of this as a increasing that accessibility and exposure and availability, as well as a kind of normalizing effect that can have. But for young people at a time of their life when decision making and risk management is difficult, again, this is why education is absolutely vital, and part of that being understanding how those decisions can be made, what's going on when those decisions are being made. In terms of motivation, because a really important thing in decision making is understanding what is your motivation. You know, why are you wanting to do this? What's going on, and being just a good way of kind of being able to be in control of the choices you're making is just being incredibly self-conscious about the choices that you're making. So this is 11 to 15-year-olds again, so, you know, little ones compared to you. But the biggest reason was curiosity, unsurprising. This is just on the first occasion, for the effect of it, because my friends were doing it. So there's just that joining in, or that normalization, or that fear of missing out. Don't ask about peer pressure. Boredom, particularly for the little 11-year-olds, wanted to forget my problems. So that relationship with mental health is already there. And of course, as you'll know, doesn't go anywhere. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So this period of change that I've been talking about, the brain is just this incredible organ. And it's research in terms of adolescent brain development is relatively recent. So it's only really been in the last 20, 25 years. And a lot of that's come as technologies developed so that living brains could be studied and not just kind of slicing up dead brains. And people could be studied while doing different activities, but also an interest in what's different about adolescence. It's not just that you're a child and then you're an adult, but the discovery of this incredibly important period of neurological development between 10 and 25 is quite new. So, I mean, I think in terms of all aspects of neuroscience and neurology, that there is so much that's still being discovered. But your brain is basically changing from what it needs to do when you're a child to what it needs to do when you're an adult, which are quite different things. And there's a process of kind of almost like rewiring. I mean, that's putting it very simplistically, but it's the different areas of your brain are basically connecting up. In some cases for the first time, in some cases in a different way. And it kind of happens from the back to the front. And obviously characteristics of adolescents, teenagers particularly, are characterized as risk takers. And there are reasons for that. And there are reasons why that there's an extent to which that's a stereotype. But there are certain situations in adolescence which mean that young people are more likely to take risks. But we are all, to a certain extent, wired to take risks. And taking risks is good, actually. I mean, and taking risks is good because it's how we learn, it's how we extend ourselves. This is a quote from, I'm going to keep quoting Lawrence Steinberg because he's amazing. And he was one of the key players really in terms of a lot of research on adolescent psychology and this child and adolescent developmental psychology. But this is in one of his many papers, I mean, it's old now, but this idea that we're kind of wired to take risks because our survival dependent on it. We have to weigh up risks, the bigger risk, the smaller risk. If we don't take this risk, then there's a bigger risk that might be waiting for us. So that's going on for adolescents in the same way, but there are lots of other factors going on as well. So one of the things that Steinberg talks about is the dual systems model of the brain, and that's because the development of the brain is happening in stages, and as I said, it develops from the back to the front, and it's that mismatching of stages of development that makes adolescence a period of life when managing decisions safely and managing risk safely can be really tricky. And left to their own devices, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting in the studies, and particularly some of the studies that Steinberg has done, is that actually left to their own devices, adolescents aren't any more prone to taking risks than adults are. There have been all sorts of studies done that have shown that actually adolescents are just as good at weighing up risk. They're just as good at gauging what the consequences might be as adults would be in the same situation. But there are certain scenarios in which they will be, in the research, so much more likely to take risks. And all of this is huge generalizations. I mean, obviously, you know, everybody out there, all of us, we're on a spectrum somewhere in terms of risk taking. So some of us will naturally get a massive buzz from jumping off a building or whatever, and other people might be really just much more cautious and careful, and that can change actually as we get older. I was remembering how when I was an adolescent, when I was a student, I went to Alton Towers and there was this ride that was called the Black Hole. I don't know if it's still there. It was amazing. It was this roller coaster in absolute total pitch dark. So you would go up, 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 and then you'd have no idea when you were going to shoot down and how far or how fast or anything. It was absolutely amazing. That would completely kill me now. A few years ago, not when my boys were at suitable age to go to Legoland, we went to I don't know if any of you've been to Legoland, but you know, the pirate log ride, and there's like a shoot down in this log thing that's about, I don't know, that goes down about a meter. That nearly killed me, the adrenaline rush, honestly. But nevertheless, on that spectrum, which I've obviously shifted along, adolescents are there just like adults are. So these are huge generalizations, but generally speaking, there are certain situations in which adolescents will take more risks. And there are different things going on. And it's to do with the balance of the bit of our brain that's associated with sensation seeking and the bit of our brain that's associated with self-regulation and our executive functions. And there are lots of studies that have shown sensation seeking increases from 10 years and peaks at 19 years, and then it kind of goes down from there. Self-regulation is much more of a steady incline and increases into the mid-20s. So you've got self-regulation isn't there but is getting better. Sensation seeking is kind of shooting up much more steeply, and then it kind of steadies out. As a consequence of that dynamic of those two things, risk-taking peaks between 13 and 16 years. So that's when it's at its height, and you don't wake up on your 17th birthday and you're suddenly incredibly sensible and risk averse. That's its peak. So it's still over for the next few years, risk management is quite difficult till really you hit your mid-20s. And that's around the world. That's something that's really interesting. This was a meta-analysis of studies that had been done globally. So in lots of different cultures and lots of different contexts. There were some variables, but generally speaking, it was those 13, 14, 15, 16. Obviously, what they were doing to take risks would be different in the different contexts, but those are peak ages. So the two key areas are the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And it's the imbalance of development that's really, really key. So your limbic system, sometimes referred to as your feeling and reacting brain, and that includes your nucleus accumbens, which processes reward. It's got different things going on in the limbic system, but these are the two key things in terms of decision making and risk. It's also got your amygdala, which processes emotion. So that's kind of like your really kind of base instinct bit of your brain. If you see a spider and scream, that's coming from your amygdala, bypassing any of your sense that says this is a tiny spider, it's really not going to hurt me. It's very instinctive emotional response. The limbic system is stimulated by social and emotional variables. So that's really where all of that stuff is happening. And the more that's going on in terms of a social and emotional context, the more that's the more active your limbic system is. And in your adolescence, your limbic system is really hypersensitive. It's very much associated with dopamine, which of course, as you will know, is the neurotransmitter that's very much involved with a number of recreational drugs. We'll go on to look at that in a sec. But in adolescence, the release of dopamine is really enhanced. Not just that, but the response to dopamine is really enhanced as well. So in your adolescence, you can get this massive, dopamine is your kind of natural happy high, and you can just get an incredible buzz from doing something in a way that you never will again, something that you register as reward, that you register as a positive experience. You get just the reward centers in the brain light up, that limbic system, those bits there in your brain, they light up like they just never will again. So make the most of it. Risk and reward are closely linked in the structure of the brain. So for all of us, risk and reward, those two go close together. So that taking the risk, that buzz you can get from shooting down in the black hole on the I can't think what it's called, helter skelter thing. The risk, the buzz that you get from that is can be like nothing else, that rush and that buzz. That's because of taking a risk. And in adolescence, that's really, really, really intensified because of all this stuff that's going on with the limbic system, which is really kind of overdeveloped and disproportionately developed in adolescence. And the biggest rewards are in response to risk as a consequence. The greater the risk, the greater the reward. And there have been lots and lots of different studies done that have been shown to demonstrate this. There have been a number of studies around, a lot of the studies done around gambling game activities or fake stocks. They're a lot to do with where the reward is monetary. There are a number, there's a thing called the Iowa gambling task, which has been used by a number of people, a number of researchers, and basically there are different packs of cards where some packs give you bigger gains, but there's greater risk. Some packs are kind of, you're less likely to win, but nevertheless it kind of, there's a lower risk. You're more likely to, it's the kind of the risk and likelihood and the balance between the two of those and the choices that people make. So there was a study that Steinberg did in 2010 with this, and people had to choose between the different packs of cards, and each was associated, as I said, with different levels of risk. And the adults would tend to start with, they try different things out, but there was a tendency then to stick, and these are generalizations I say, because some adults love taking risk and get a buzz from it as well. But the tendency to play from the risky packs was very, very much stronger in 14 to 21-year-olds. Even though they ended up losing money, they were still choosing. In fact, that's a driver. I mean, of course, and that's something that's going on in terms of gambling as well. We've then got the prefrontal cortex, and that's the very last bit to connect up. So that doesn't really connect up properly until you're in your mid-20s. And that, as I said, that's a kind of a steady incline, but that's sometimes referred to as the thinking brain, because it's where we have all of our executive functions, all those higher level cognitive functions, the planning, organizing, decision-making, problem solving, thinking ahead, acting with consequences in mind, all that kind of what would happen if stuff. It's also the bit that helps us with self-regulation, with moderating our social behavior, kind of moderating our impulses and emotions. It's the bit of our brain that helps us manage social interactions positively. It's kind of where our self-awareness sits quite a lot. And these, again, a lot of these things happen in other places as well, but this is predominantly what's going on with the prefrontal cortex. It's also the bit of our brain that stores negative information. So if something goes wrong for us, if we take a risk and it doesn't work out, that bit of information stored in our prefrontal cortex. If we take a risk and it was amazing, that's stored in our limbic system. That will generate a reward pathway in our limbic system. So with adolescence, carrot is definitely better than stick, and much less likely. It's going to take quite a long while to access that memory, that risk didn't pay off last time. Hence that kind of keeping on choosing those risky packs of cards, even though they knew that they were losing money on the whole with it. And then there's the whole role of peers and peer influence, and it's is such a powerful force all the way through adolescence and into early 20s. I mean, to be honest, it never really goes away. You never really quite stop worrying about what people are thinking about you, and that's partly because it's the way that we're programmed to a certain extent, if you believe in programming, which I don't really, but it's kind of, there's a sort of instinctive, there's a sort of evolutionary imperative in a way. Some of that's to do with times when our survival literally depended on following the crowd, or being socially accepted, being if you were cast out of your group, then you could literally be vulnerable to getting eaten by lions or wild bears or whatever it would be. There's also a kind of cognitive efficiency. If everybody else thinks it's right, then it probably is. And of course, that's complete nonsense and is often not the case. But we haven't got time. We can't possibly research every individual decision that needs to be made and find out what the evidence base is. You know, a lot of the time we just kind of go, well, if everyone else thinks it's a good idea, then it probably is. We'll assume that it's okay. That's an alleged quote from Alfred North Whitehead, a philosopher, mathematician actually. Civilization advances by extending the number of operations we can perform without thinking about them, that kind of cognitive efficiency. But in adolescence, again, there are various other dynamics going on. As I said, they tend to gauge risk the same as adults do, left to their own devices. But when in a social context, that's when it all changes. There's this heightened sensitivity to social reward and also social exclusion. So you can generate what Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's really, really worth reading, or she's done a brilliant TED talk if you haven't got time to read a book, what she calls a social risk factor, so that you could be weighing up risks, the known risks of a substance. You know, you've had your drugs education, you know, all your harm reduction stuff, you know that this is risky, and you know that the risk you're taking might be one that isn't going to pay off, and yet you've got to weigh that up against the risk of possibly being excluded by this group of people that instinctively have a whole bigger baggage of risks around it. Consequently, in adolescence, people will take more risks when they're with their peers than when they're on their own. There's a study that's Friends Drive Friends to Take Risks. That's based on another Steinberg. Sorry, I do keep harping on about Steinberg. But he did a study, I think it was Steinberg. I'm trying to see where I wrote it down. He did a thing called the stoplight task, which was a driving simulating game. That was in 2005, and then now I wrote about it. But so people were in this driving game, and they had to kind of get round the track as quickly as they could, but there were traffic lights around the way, and when they got to a light, they had to, if it was yellow, if it was amber, they had to make the choice: do they jump it and take the chance that it would go red and they might have a crash, or do they wait in case do they wait for it to turn green, do they wait for it to stop and then start again? So basically it was taking risks. Do they risk having an accident in order to get around the track more quickly? Adolescents doing it on their own and adults doing it on their own. They divided it into three groups, age groups. So they had 13 to 16-year-olds, they had 17 to 24-year-olds, and then they had 25 plus, so adults effectively. The younger adolescents, 13 to 16, all of them across the board, their accident rate on their own was about the same. But as soon as they brought their friends along, they're invited to bring their own friends into this scenario, so there were people that they knew, the younger ones immediately started taking more risks. So for the 13 to 16-year-olds, they were taking on average 3 times more risks, having 3 times more accidents. Sorry, I should say it's not just the taking of the risks, it's having the accidents. With the older ones, it was getting on for twice as many. So really significant in terms of taking risks, and those risks not always paying off. Basically, this is Sarah Jane Blakemore commenting on all of this. That's a brilliant book. Up to the age of 25, you're more likely to crash if you've got passengers in your car. Over the age of 25 or 26 plus, you're less likely. To actually acts as a protective factor, because once you become an adult, you actually take more care when you're driving, when you've got other people in the car. That's why in some countries, some US states, and I think Australia as well, you can't have passengers in your car until you're over a certain age, until you've been driving for so many years. So here's my little bit of practical advice, and forgive me if this seems at all patronising, but I'm aware that some of the people watching this might be still in that period of adolescence when decision making is difficult and drugs are around. And however much you know about harm reduction, it's still being able to bring that to that decision making. And when it comes to drugs, there are so many decisions. You know, it's not just a yes, no. As you will know, the yes is the beginning of a whole series of decisions that have to be made in order to make sure that that person gets to go home safely. And each of those decisions is going to be complicated by all the stuff that's going on if you're in your adolescence, all of those different dynamics we're talking about. So just some kind of a checklist, if you like, of questions. What's your motivation here and now? So you might think, well, I do use drugs because of whatever, but actually, is that why you're thinking about using drugs on this occasion, and being really self-conscious about your motivation, but also the motivation of the people around you, which could be very different from what it is on other occasions. What's your mood and what are your expectations in the here and now, in this particular time and place? Because apart from anything else, that's going to influence the experience that you have. That will alter the effect that any substances have on you, the experience. Would you make the same decision if you're on your own? That's coming back to this role of peers, and knowing that if you're in adolescence, you're going to be more likely to take peers. If you're in that 17 to 24-year-olds, you're more likely to take risks if you've got your friends with you, twice as likely, according to that study. How can you buy yourself a bit more time to access your prefrontal cortex? So it just takes that little bit longer to get into that bit of your brain that will remember that thing that maybe didn't work so well last time, and just to kind of think things through and regulate your responses and emotions. So it might be just kind of stalling tactics, or what can you do to just kind of delay, or just give yourself that little bit of a step back before jumping in. Sometimes you can plan ahead. If you know that you might feel in this situation, you might end up doing something that is a risk that you're not prepared to take, or you're going to end up doing something that you're going to regret later. You can plan ahead. As human beings, we're programmed to respect a reason, even if it's a terrible reason. If somebody's got a reason and they say it with confidence, then generally speaking, people just kind of let them get away with it. But you might want to plan an excuse. You might just want to avoid. Sometimes it's just best not to be there. And also think about how substance use, whether it's your own or other people's, might be affecting decision making. So, for example, an obvious example is if someone's had a few drinks, then their judgment and decision making is impaired. So the management of risks will be harder. And it's the same with any substances. Any substances will start to affect your ability to make decisions clearly and bring all of that stuff to bear that you might normally bring to bear to make them safe. I'm going to fly through this next bit because it's kind of much more general stuff in terms of how drugs act on the brain, but it's also useful in terms of, because we're going to come back to adolescence as well, and drug use and the difference that there is in adolescence. So keeping that in mind, that there are really important neurological changes going on in adolescence. How drugs, it's not just drugs in the brain, this is how the brain works really, very, 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 very simplistically. Basically, you've got about 100 billion nerve cells in your brain, which are called neurons. And all of the neurons have got axons, which is like a tail, and dendrites, which is kind of this branch-like stuff going on. So because what neurons do is they send messages, they are forever communicating with other neurons. And they do that across synapses. So kind of messages go along the axon of one neuron into the dendrite of the next neuron, and jump across the synapses like a little gap. And neurotransmitters are what jump from across that gap, and they have to into a receptor on the other neuron. And that's where it all gets kind of clever, because different neurotransmitters do that in different ways, and they have to fit in the right way. So they will send the right kind of message around, if you like. It's just really, really simplistic. Sorry for anybody that knows more about these things. And basically they do that in two different ways. It's so incredibly complex. So again, apologies, this is so simplistic, but basically some of them are called excitatory. The excitatory, they will excite, they will stimulate, they will make those neurotransmitters kind of go faster, do more of what they're doing. Some of those will inhibit it, so they'll kind of slow down the reaction of those neurotransmitters, and that's really important in terms of what that message is going to be doing, and the signal that it's going to be sending, the communication that it will then be sending around the rest of your body. So all of that is this control center, that everything that we think, that we do, that the way that we experience reality, everything that we say, everything comes from all these communications in our brain. And what drugs do, of course, is they alter that. They're making alterations to the way the neurons are sending, receiving, and processing signals. They're making changes to those neurotransmitters in lots of different ways. There are these basic categories of effect in terms of what they do: stimulants, sedatives, hallucinogens, dissociative, empathogens, cannabinoids, and you can break them down even further. But they all of that, that's how drugs do what they do. They're making alterations to the way that your brain would normally be communicating with itself to send those signals and to control what we're doing, basically, I guess, and the experience of reality. That is why people take what they're doing, to feel differently. There are certain neurotransmitters that are particularly affected or particularly involved in the psychoactive substance use experience. So dopamine would be the one that most people might think of first. That's very much the pleasure and reward neurotransmitter. Serotonin is very much to do with mood, appetite, libido, sleep. So cocaine, amphetamines, MDMA is in the serotonin, and LSD as well. Cannabinoids, obviously cannabis, and that's learning, memory, motivation, mood, concentration, appetite, hence the munchies. Noradrenaline, again, memory, mood, sleep and anxiety. So cocaine and amphetamines would act particularly on noradrenaline. Glutamate, learning, memory, cognition. Ketamine and alcohol with that GABA we've got opioids as well. So those are neurotransmitters that we have already, and then different drugs will do different things to different ones of the different neurotransmitters in different ways, and it's really complex, which is why I wanted to whiz through it, because it's otherwise it just gets incredibly complicated. Using MDMA as a case study, because that's my little case study that I started with, the way that MDMA operates on the brain, it stimulates the release of serotonin, which is neurotransmitter associated with regulation of mood. They do different things, but in the combination of stuff that's going on and the way that MDMA acts on the brain, that's what serotonin is doing. Dopamine, pleasure and reward. Norepinephrine, alertness and arousal. So that kind of buzz and rush and euphoria that you can get, and that sense of kind of connectedness. The oxytocin that really does that kind of sense of love and connectedness and kind of general well-being that you can get with MDMA and ecstasy. Vasopressin is social behavior. So like, any of you that know how MDMA affects people, that is, I guess, a key part of what makes that different from cocaine, for example, what makes MDMA a very different experience. But of course, those neurotransmitters and the way they act on the brain are also what can then cause harm. And this is where the harm reduction and the risk management and the decision making is so key, because it's how they're acting on the brain that can then lead the signals that are changing in that person's system can be what leads to the harm that can be caused. So serotonin does what it does partly by increasing your heart rate, raising your blood pressure and your body temperature. Serotonin is called serotonin syndrome. If there's an excessive release of serotonin, that's what causes that muscle rigidity, the kind of gurning that people can have. An excess release of serotonin is what also leads to those Blue Tuesdays, or whatever people call them these days. But that really low mood, you've got this depletion of serotonin. It takes a while for your body to kind of restore that. And that's kind of, again, that's your regulation of mood. That's what can make you feel okay about yourself and the world. Norepinephrine, which gives you that sense of alertness and arousal, it does that partly by, again, increasing your heart rate, your blood pressure and your body temperature. But that, of course, can be incredibly risky. One of the big risks from MDMA and what went wrong for Dan was that that incredible spike in body temperature. Your body temperature spiking very, very high, very quickly. Your heart rate going incredibly fast can lead to heart attacks, and so on. And then vasopressin, that which gives you all that kind of bondedness, that connectedness, that kind of extra sensory stuff that goes on, that also can have an antidiuretic effect. That's why you can have those really depleted sodium levels with MDMA, which can cause kidney damage and ultimately kidney failure. So that's where this balance, what it's doing on the way that drugs are acting on the brain, can do both welcome and unwelcome things, I guess, is the thing. And a quick word before I finish about addiction. Obviously, different people using drugs in lots and lots of different ways. Addiction is or substance use disorder or dependency. There's lots and lots of different words that can be used, and lots of kind of politics and lots of important conversations around what's an appropriate terminology to use. But I'm just going to use addiction because it's what Susie Gage used, and I love Susie Gage. But basically, it's to do with the relationship that an individual has with that substance. It's not to do with how much or how often. It's to do with the role that that person that substance has in that person's life, and the way that it can then go on to affect that person's brain. We've talked about the different parts of your brain, the different brain regions, and that prefrontal cortex and that limbic system, and those the dopamine that's the neurotransmitter that's very much associated with reward. And with when a person becomes addicted to a substance, that reward pathway is incredibly strengthened, and the synapses, the bits that are connecting that person's brain to their prefrontal cortex, where they can think things through and kind of rationalize stuff, they're pruned away. They're just used less and less because it's so highly focused on the reward that's being got from using this substance. Reward is used in a neuroscientific way, not in terms of this is really rewarding, because it can stop becoming rewarding at all. But nevertheless, it's that's the brain is kind of literally rewiring itself around using this substance. But there are lots and lots of different factors at work in addiction, which I haven't really got time to talk about. But the really interesting stuff around what leads people to become addicted or not to the biopsychosocial model of addiction. Really interesting study by Lee Robbins of Vietnam veterans and their use of heroin. Rat Park, which I'm sure most of you watching this that will be interested in these sorts of things will be more than aware of. And then, of course, there's the relationship in terms of neurology, but the mental health and addiction thing, which is another whole complex thing and a whole chicken and egg thing. Underlying mental health issues can mean that people might use substances as a kind of coping strategy, but that can also be a motivation that's more likely to lead to addiction. That type of use can be more likely to lead to dependency, to need that to cope. And it can also exacerbate, ironically, because obviously you're using substances that are making alterations to the way that your brain is functioning. That's going to, at some point, it's very, very, very likely to start affecting your mental health and well-being. And there are other risk factors as well. There are certain substances that can be that are more addictive than others, and trauma can play a really key role. Of course, there's been a lot of talk about adverse childhood experiences. I haven't been able to find any data, but anecdotally, and the numbers of people that are in treatment for drug addictions, for substance use disorders, who have experienced trauma is huge. In terms of adults in treatment, I'll just put this, I'll whiz through this because I'm sorry I've talked for too long. I thought you might be interested to know that in terms of adults in treatment, mostly they're there for opiates. So that's mostly heroin substitutes, prescription opioids, 28% for alcohol, 59% had a mental health treatment need. In terms of young people, so that's under 18s, it's almost all cannabis. And then a lot of alcohol. Most common vulnerability was starting use before the age of 15. So the younger people start, so again, drugs education is just so absolutely vital. The younger people start using drugs, the more likely they are then to develop life problems that will last. And most of those adults in treatment will have started using drugs when they were in their teens. And more than a third of young people said they'd got a mental health need. And the big issue really with addiction in adolescence, one of the issues is because the brain is going through such a critical period of change, and it's kind of wired to learn, and there are some ways in which addiction is a learned behavior, and so it's easier to become addicted in adolescence, and it's harder to shake it off. It's harder, not shake it off is really the wrong phrase, sorry, but it's really harder to climb out of it from adolescence. So again, why it's just so absolutely vital that young people have access to really good, effective, evidence-based drugs education, why we do what we do, and why it's all so important. And my last slide almost, I think, is you must watch this TED Talk. I saw it referenced in a talk on Monday, and I haven't been able to get to any others, so it might be that everyone is referencing it. But Johann Hari, everything you think you know about addiction is wrong. It's brilliant. He talks about Rat Park on there. But this really key thing, the opposite of addiction is connection. And that's connection in so many different ways. And at the end of the day, we are social beings, and everything we do is in a social context. And that's where we come back again to decision making and the complexities of that, particularly in that stage of life when that social environment and the role of our peers and the relationship with our peers is important in a way that it hasn't ever been before, and probably will never be again. And that's the end. That's me. Sorry. Thanks. Sorry, because I've talked too long. I meant to allow more for questions, but I'm hoping to throw any questions. They're not really difficult.
That was great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And unmute and applause if you want to. Amazing. Yeah, really interesting talk. Thank you so much, Fiona.
That's a pleasure.
Yeah, we've got some
questions.
That's all right. As long as you're okay with it, we're happy to go over the time.
Yeah.
We've got a whole hour until the next talk, so we've got some questions in the chat. I'll start with this one. This is my question. What challenges have you and your foundation faced in opening a dialogue about drugs with teens?
The challenge mainly is the people that are around the teens, to be honest. Teenagers are really, really open and quite hungry actually to have an honest conversation about drugs and drug use, but it's really difficult to do that in a school, because it's really difficult for schools to, you know, just before this I was in a meeting with the Home Office and Public Health England and Department of Health, and it was a really, really interesting, and I was so excited that the conversation was happening about recreational drug use and what can be done, and because the message, the agenda, it's a conversation that's really, and one of the things that I was saying in the meeting, it's really difficult in terms of drugs education and harm reduction with young people, because it's really difficult to have that conversation honestly, and some of that is because of the criminal status of drugs, and it means that schools, basically you shouldn't be doing it, so we best not talk about it, but they're around for young people, and there are some young people that are using drugs, and it's really, really important that they're able to ask questions and find things out and talk honestly about what the issues are, and be talked to honestly as well. So, and it's not, generally speaking, it's not that schools don't want to or recognize that that's something important. It's just they feel in a very difficult position, and they worry about parents. You know, if they start saying any kind of message that might go out, like, this is how you do drugs safely. I mean, the harm reduction message in terms of universal drugs education has to be quite carefully framed anyway, because you can risk kind of normalizing something. But nevertheless, it's absolutely vital, especially with older teens. But schools worry about what parents will think. Parents worry about their kids getting in trouble if they talk to the schools about something. So it's a really difficult space primarily because of the stigma, and because of the criminal status of it, really. Not that necessarily if everything was legalized it'd be easier, and that's another whole conversation, because the stigma, I don't know, the stigma is very complicated and very kind of deep-seated, but that's another conversation, really.
Yeah, I think that kind of ties in with the question that Isabel asked. She says drug policies are often, brackets, sadly, not based on harm reduction. Which changes would you suggest? Would you suggest or like to see in order to move toward harm reduction, especially at university, as this is often the first time people properly kind of experiment with different substances?
Yeah, so I don't know what it's like at Royal Holloway. I know that the Students for Safer Drug Policy, they've got chapters at a growing number of UK universities as well. And I know that a lot of UK universities are really developing their policies. And you guys will probably know lots more about that than I do, but
yeah, that's kind of our fight. We're fighting the
your
fight with
fight.
our university, and
Right.
and
Well, good for
trying to
you.
campaign for policy change, but it's sadly a difficult one because of university bureaucracy and all of the kind of layers that we have to go through, which I'm sure are not that dissimilar to schools.
It sounds very, very similar. I'm just thinking of a conversation that I had. So with the school the other day, we were going to do a workshop for parents, and we send out a survey ahead so parents can present questions beforehand if they want to. And one of the parents had asked, if I know that my son is using drugs, is this something that I could talk to the school about? And I'd been into the school before, and I'd done a workshop with the students. It's a lovely school and a really caring deputy head. And she'd said at the end of my talk, I was talking to the sixth form, and she said, you know, anybody that needs any support, there's a school counsellor. We've got we're linked in with the local treatment service, so you can talk to your form tutor or whatever. So I sent this question to them and say, I know that you've got really good pastoral policies and so on in place. What would happen if a parent was worried about their son using drugs? But she had to refer that to senior lead. She had to refer that to the head. I mean, she's in senior management, because actually what would happen, because it's possible actually that they might get excluded from school. So that whole conversation is really difficult. It's just the same at universities, I think. It's just on a different level. How do you, and it's really hard, because she as an individual would really be concerned about that boy being okay and getting the support that he needed. But actually the school policies are so different, and the same with universities. I think there's for many schools and universities, it's the kind of being able to sit down themselves and have an honest conversation about actually what do we want for our students, what do we want for our pupils, where does somebody represent a threat and a risk to the student population, and where at what point are they somebody that's in need of support. But actually a lot of the time for students, it's not that they need support, because a lot of universities would say, well, we've got counsellors and we've got treatment services, but actually most people that use drugs don't need treatment and they don't need counselling, but they do need really good advice, and they do need really good information in a place that they can go to. I was just having a chat the other day with somebody who's actually, she's doing her master's, journalism master's, and she's focusing on, she was at Bristol, and they've got the Bristol Drugs Project, which do some really, really interesting work. They're offering drugs. Yeah, so that was really, really interesting. So I was talking to her about that, and what they're doing is very much like what other drug checking organisations will do, where it's not just checking people's drugs, but it's that really important conversation around what that would look like. But the university enabling that to happen is a really significant step change. A lot of universities, that just enabling that conversation to happen is something they'd have to really shift their policy around.
Yeah,
it's really difficult.
I think we hope that will kind of like have a domino effect for all universities across the UK, but it is difficult. But in light of what you've said about schools, I think we're actually quite lucky, because we have an opportunity to be on social media platforms and speak directly to student populace, because we are students and we're also technically adults. And so we don't need permission to talk to student populations, which is quite good, I guess. That the only problem is the institution. But yeah, thank you. One question I do have is, how do you go about kind of talking to adolescents and teenagers about neurological like development? Because I know when I was 15, and Ivan was going to ask this question as well, but I'm sorry, Ivan. I know when I was 15, I thought I knew everything there was to know. And I thought my parents were stupid and they didn't know anything about drugs, so why would I listen to them anyway? How do you go about kind of talking to kids without telling them that their prefrontal cortex is limiting them? Because I know when I was 15, I wouldn't want to hear that.
I do talk about their prefrontal cortex limiting them. We do talk about it, because I think it's really important that it's this thing about being really self-conscious about that decision making. And if you know in that moment of decision, actually it's really difficult to think sensibly, and you could end up doing something. You're going to be much more likely to kind of act on impulse and act from that emotional part of your brain, and you might end up doing something that you really don't want to do when you've got a moment to think about it or look back or kind of climb out of it. That was a really, that didn't end well. And so knowing that that dynamic is making things harder for you and making your decision making more complicated, I think I think is just everything that can be done to enable teenagers to be more self-conscious about that decision making. And just something as simple as knowing that when you're with your friends, you're more likely to take risks. Just knowing that, if you can keep that question in your head, okay, is this something I would do when I was on my own? If I can just take that moment to take a step outside it and go, if I was on my own in my room, would I be doing this? And if the answer is no, you've then got to work out how to get out of it. But it is really difficult because you're talking to someone whose brain isn't kind of making those connections anyway. And of course, your parents know nothing and they're stupid and really embarrassing. And, it's difficult to come around that as well. But I think one of the things we do is working with parents, because parents don't know as much as they need to, and they are they can know more, but for parents as well, it's also about knowing how to have those conversations. How do they talk to their 15-year-old? How do they make that a comfortable conversation on both sides? But it's a tricky one, but it's important, because the decision making is a really, really important part of it all. You can know as much as, you're surrounded by incredibly intelligent people at university, but I bet you see people making really stupid mistakes, and it's not that they're not clever and they don't know stuff, but they're still, their brain isn't wired up properly yet, depending on how old they are. All of us do, let's be honest, all of us can do some stupid things when we're with our friends.
I have my own theories about why we might be resistant to hearing that, but I'll leave that to another time. What else do we have here? Rosie says, I wonder what advice you would give to someone whose friend might be struggling with decision making related to drugs, and what kind of support would be best to encourage them to make safe decisions.
Sorry, can you say that again? I got distracted by a message from Ivan. He's going off to prepare for his talk. So sorry, if you've got a friend, you're concerned about a friend making bad decisions about their drugs.
And what kind of support would you recommend for them?
Do you know, it's such a hard one, but that's a question that we often get asked by students at the end of workshops. It's at the end of workshops. If we're in a school, so you can't do it on now where everything's online, but if we're in a school and you can have those informal chats afterwards, that's where students would come. And very often people are really worried about a friend and how they can have those conversations. I guess some of it is it's difficult when you're in that friendship relationship because you don't want to damage that relationship. But I guess it's some of that is knowing on the basis of your relationship, kind of how can you, every friendships are different. So there are lines that you might cross or toes that you might tread on differently with different people. But it can be quite useful to take a kind of I guess maybe help that person to reflect in a way by maybe asking some questions, in maybe a coaching kind of way, but not coaching them obviously, but just helping them to reflect themselves on the decisions they've been making, and maybe what was going on for them when they made that decision, and what's the impact being on their lives of the decisions they're making and the people around them. And if there's somebody that needs help, obviously they can access help, but I imagine it's probably more around maybe taking risks or doing things that are that you can see are just limiting their opportunities or stopping them from being their best selves, or all that sort of thing.
So perhaps the attitude that we might have is to ask why rather than tell people no.
Find out what's going on for them, and whether they feel that they could make choices differently, and whether they're finding decisions difficult themselves. Maybe it is just with that group of friends they end up getting off their face on whatever or whatever it is, and so perhaps are they the best people to hang around with, or those sorts of conversations. Making sure that people are making choices that are really right for them, and safe choices, importantly.
Yeah, great. Another one of my questions. Do you have any books or kind of, resources for advice for parents or just anyone interested in these issues?
That
recommend?
seemed like a really great, like, planted question. Was it, I have just written a book for parents. Was that a planted question?
No, it wasn't. I had no idea you'd just written a book for parents. And now you're exposing me for my lack of preparation for this as well now.
No, I know, I'm just, otherwise it would look like it was a real plant, but I have actually, it happens, just written a book for parents, which is going to be published 5 weeks tomorrow, which is
great.
Would have been Dan's 24th birthday, but it's called I Wish I'd Known, because it's all the stuff that I wish I'd known 7 years ago. So it's basically a parents' workshop, and there's quite a lot of story in it as well, but the story is kind of like, and this is why this matters, and there's a focus on there's a chapter on the teenage brain and decision making, there's a chapter on kind of risks and effects and variable factors, there's a chapter on drugs and the law, which I thought would be really short, but ended up being really long. I had to chop loads out. There's a chapter on if you've got problems or concerns, a chapter on staying safe, and lots of kind of practical strategies around that. So look out for I Wish I'd Known, coming out on 27th of May, available now to pre-order.
Will it be on the website?
Yeah, it's on our
foundation.
Yeah, so
okay, great.
On our homepage, you can link to it there. So buy it for your parents.
Perfect. Great, thank you.
And it's kind of quite a, I think for anyone working with young people or concerned about this, kind of just quite a, hopefully a useful practical kind of handbook to it all. Thank you, Bree.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it as well. I'll order it as soon as it comes out. I'm sure people have already told you this, but just thank you for turning your experience and turning your son's story into this incredible foundation. It was very moving to hear your talk.
Thanks.
We've got another couple questions.
Oh, thank you. Nick's put the link up in the chat.
Thank you, Nick. In a country that heavily criminalizes substance use, it is a huge taboo asking information about drugs. It was interesting to observe that young people in high school or university had an increased inclination to look up research about substances and learn how it is done. Yeah, it is interesting. And we're doing that as well at DNA. We've got a Know Your Stuff program where we send out information as well. But is that a heavy part of your foundation as well?
What, sorry, sending out information? Or...
Yeah, sending out information about drugs specifically and how people can reduce harm and perhaps move towards a kind of spectrum of safety.
Yeah, to be honest, we do a lot of signposting. So one of the places, I don't know if people are staying on for Ivan's talk next, but one of the key places we signpost to is Drugs and Me, because it's just got such really, really accessible and detailed, specific harm reduction advice about individual substances, and that also kind of gets us around doing the harm reduction stuff to students in a workshop when we're talking to like a whole year. Well, it means that we can do that in a second-hand way, but it's just so important that people have access to good information. This is going back to 7 years ago. So much has changed. 7 years ago there was just Frank, and Frank was, with all due respect to the people that host Frank, it was pretty ropey and really inaccurate in terms of stuff to do with MDMA and in particular, but all sorts of other things as well. And it got so many gaps. They've only just added Xanax relatively recently. They gave it a big overhaul, I think 2 years ago now, maybe 18 months ago, and it's much, much better than it was. But there was nothing detailed like Drugs and Me. That's happened within these last 7 years. There wasn't I don't think, was drug science up and running then, but even then that wouldn't necessarily be something that 15, 16-year-olds were looking at, or even 16, 17-year-olds. But no, access to really good information is really vital. And other stuff like, looking at the Loop social media and Pill Report and all that's Wedenos, you know, where there are a lot more sources of information, I think, than there were 7-8 years ago, possibly 10 years ago.
Great, yeah. Final question from me, just off the bat. How can we support the foundation? I'm sure it's all listed on your website, but what's the best way to support your work?
Well, something that would be amazing. I mean, any fundraising. Obviously, we're a charity, so but I know you're poor students, so don't worry too much about that one. But one of the
things. Try.
Ask your parents to make donations. And most of what we do for nothing, because most schools we ask the independent schools to make a donation, but we don't charge state schools, and 3/4 of the schools we work with are state schools, so we do that for nothing because they haven't got any money. But really, it would be fantastic. I'm really wanting to. I'm starting to have some conversations with a few different universities, and really keen to find out what we can do to work with students and undergraduates and postgrads to support drugs education. The conversations I've been having with students, and some of this was with the TEDx team actually after doing the talk, just saying that they're coming to university with no drugs education, and yet drugs are around. So is there anything that we can do? It's a very different space, obviously, than, you know, organising to go in and talk to a group of year 10s in a school is very different than, you know, setting up a workshop in a university would be a very different thing. You haven't got a captive audience in the same way, but also there are different issues and different concerns. So what would work, and being able to work with you or anybody that would like to get involved in developing something that could work for students. It was just the most heartbreaking thing in September when there were those freshers' deaths. I mean, it's the deaths that hit, the fatalities that hit the headlines, isn't it? But it was just so tragic. There's students that died. I think there were 2, they'd only just arrived at university and died from drug use. And it's obviously that's the worst case scenario. But there are so many unnecessary harms that are happening and risks that are being taken that don't need to be taken. With more information. So it would be basically, it'd be lovely to work together. Oh, first you moved. There's a little comment. Sorry, I should be dig inboxes. Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, I don't know, does drug information go into those things? Because I know, I mean, this is another thing. You see, one of these are my my peers who've got kids going off to university, and someone who started as a fresher got a box, and there was like a drugs harm reduction guide in this box. I can't remember what university it was, and they were horrified. They're telling them how to do drugs safely. This is awful. It's outrageous. It's tricky.
Yeah, I think it's tricky.
Yeah,
I think it's particularly tricky as well because you don't want to do that and then have a student call their parents and be like, oh my god, I can't believe this university is talking about this.
Yeah, and yet
because it looks bad for parents. They don't then want to help their children look for universities that are dealing with that.
Yeah, Sheffield got really bad press, didn't they, a few years ago when they there was some really negative media coverage when they started offering some harm reduction stuff, and Newcastle when they were doing drug testing, when they introduced that. And it's difficult, and that's where education for parents is so important as well, because actually parents, if they are aware that their child may also be somebody that on occasion might say yes to something, then they would much rather know that they knew how those risks could be managed than knew nothing and would take a silly risk that might end up going badly wrong.
Exactly.
Karen
says, I fully relate to having harm reduction blocked. I tried to set up an information booth at university and I was unfortunately shot down. Hopefully things are changing.
Yeah.
That's what we hope too. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Shall I put my email address in the... let me put my email address in the chat.
Yes, please. I'll also put some stuff in about us as well.
I've got too many W's there, sorry. TSM Foundation. Oh, There's our website as well. It'd be great if anyone wants to contact. It'd be great because we'd love to find ways to support universities better.
Great, thank you. I will just pop in some information about this as well. If anybody on here would like to receive a recording of this or a link to our YouTube channel, you can sign up to our mailing list using this Google Sheets, and you'll receive all of the updates and also hopefully some kind of digital goodie bags and things that we're working on. So yeah, I hope you can make some of our other talks, and thank you, Fiona. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, that's
Thank
pretty much
you.
it.